The cold seeped through the thin fabric of her worn-out coat, a damp, gnawing chill that felt less like weather and more like a permanent state of being. Her fingers, numb and stiff, clutched the crumpled bills in her pocket, the paper soft and fragile from countless, desperate recountings. $50. That was the final, brutal sum, the last remnant of a life that had been systematically dismantled, piece by piece, since the shrill ring of the phone, the one that had shattered her world with the clipped, impersonal news of a scaffolding collapse and a husband she would never hold again. The construction company's condolences were as hollow as their empty promises of compensation, leaving her crushed under a mountain of medical debt. Now, all that remained were the echoes of that loss, the phantom weight of the bills, and the sharp, undeniable ache of hunger gnawing at her insides. She listened to the shallow, wheezing breaths of her 10-year-old son, Leo, asleep beside her on the park bench, his small face pale and gaunt under the sickly orange glow of the streetlights. A wave of hot nausea rose in her throat. She had failed him. The eviction notice, a stark white ghost, was still taped to the door of an apartment that was no longer theirs. The lock had been changed. They were outside, utterly and completely outside of everything. She felt her heart tighten into a small, cold knot of pure despair. The city hummed around them, a monstrous, indifferent machine of screeching tires and distant, mournful sirens. Each sound was a fresh jab of pure anxiety. A well-dressed couple walked past, their easy laughter a sharp, painful sting, their perfume smelling of a warm, clean world Elena no longer belonged to. She pulled the thin, threadbare blanket tighter around Leo, trying to shield him from the biting wind that whipped down the concrete canyon of the street. His small frame shivered against her, a constant, trembling reminder of her powerlessness. "Mom, are we going home soon?" he had whispered an hour ago, his voice thick with sleep and confusion. She had choked back a sob, murmuring a hollow lie about waiting for a friend. The shame was a physical thing, a hot flush that burned her cheeks despite the freezing air. She carried their entire world in a single frayed backpack that dug painfully into her shoulders, a pathetic collection of a few clothes and Leo's worn teddy bear. Every passing shadow looked like a threat, every stranger's glance a judgment. This wasn't poverty, it was a terrifying freefall, and the ground was rushing up to meet them. She felt a primal panic rising, the fear of a mother unable to shelter her young. Her breath hitched in her chest, small and tight. Then, a memory surfaced, unbidden, from the deepest corners of her childhood. A story her grandmother used to tell, her voice raspy with age, about the place she had spent her youth, the Blackwood textile mill, a colossal brick monster on the industrial outskirts of town, silent for decades, a hulking monument to a forgotten era. It was scheduled for demolition soon. The thought was insane, a flicker of madness born from pure desperation. But what was the alternative? Freezing to death on this bench? The image of the mill formed in her mind's eye, a skeletal silhouette against a bruised purple sky. The wind, she imagined, would whistle through its shattered panes of glass like the sighs of the women who once worked there. A shiver, not of cold, but of profound dread, traced its icy way down her spine. Could she do it? Could she break in, become a squatter, a ghost herself in that vast, decaying place? The thought sent a jolt of terror through her, but then she felt Leo stir, his small hand instinctively finding hers, his fingers curling trustingly around her thumb. That small, warm pressure was an anchor. It was the only reason she hadn't shattered completely. The mill wasn't a choice between right and wrong anymore. It was a choice between a terrifying chance and a certain, freezing end. Her decision solidified, hard and cold as steel in her gut. They would go. Gently, she woke Leo, her voice a strained whisper about going to a secret place, a big castle they could explore. She tried to force a smile, but her lips felt stiff and foreign, a mask of courage she did not feel. The boy, still groggy with sleep, trusted her without question. The walk was long, a slow pilgrimage from the city's concrete heart to its decaying industrial edge. The air itself changed, the familiar scent of exhaust and fast food giving way to the smell of rust, damp earth, and something vaguely chemical that burned the back of her throat. The crunch of their shoes on broken asphalt and shattered glass was unnervingly loud in the oppressive silence. The mill loomed over them, larger and more menacing up close, its brick walls stained black with soot and time, its windows like 1,000 vacant eyes staring into nothing. A chain-link fence, topped with rusted barbed wire, surrounded the property. For a moment, her hope withered, but then she saw it, a section near the back where the fence had been peeled away from its post, creating a narrow gap. It was an invitation from decay itself. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as she squeezed through the opening, the cold metal snagging her coat. She helped Leo through, his small body trembling. Before them was a heavy side door, its wood splintered. She pushed. It groaned, a low guttural sound, and gave way just enough to reveal a sliver of absolute impenetrable blackness. Stepping inside was like stepping into a cold, forgotten tomb. The darkness was total, a physical presence that immediately swallowed the faint city glow from the open doorway. Elena fumbled for the small, cheap flashlight in her bag, its weak yellow beam cutting a pathetic circle through the gloom. Dust motes, thick as a biblical plague of insects, swarmed in the light. The air was heavy and stagnant, thick with the smell of mold and rat droppings, so dense she felt she could taste the decay on her tongue. A constant, faint dripping sound echoed from somewhere deep within the cavernous space. A lonely, maddening rhythm. "It's big, Mommy," Leo whispered, his voice small and awed, his hand clutching her jeans. Elena knew they couldn't stay on the ground floor, too exposed. Her grandmother had worked in the finishing department, up in the attic. She found a set of groaning metal stairs and began the slow, terrifying climb, her hand gripping the cold, gritty railing for dear life. Each step echoed ominously. When they finally pushed open the door to the attic, the sight stole what little breath she had left. It was a vast, shadowy expanse under a skeletal roof, with gaping holes that revealed the starless, black sky. The floorboards groaned in protest under their weight. This was it. This was their shelter. A freezing, filthy, forgotten space at the top of a dying building. Elena pulled Leo close, sinking to the dusty floor, and the last of her strength gave way. Tears she hadn't allowed herself to cry finally came, silent and hot, tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. Despair washed over her, cold and final. The hope that had propelled them here, a desperate, flickering flame, was immediately extinguished by the suffocating reality of the attic. As her tears subsided, leaving cold tracks on her dirty skin, a deeper chill set in, one that radiated from the floorboards themselves. It was a damp, profound cold that seemed to emanate from the very bones of the building. She swept the weak beam of her flashlight across the space, and the sheer scale of the neglect was staggering. A thick, gray-brown blanket of dust, undisturbed for what must have been decades, coated every surface, softening the hard edges of forgotten machinery into monstrous, sleeping shapes. The air was so full of it that the light beam seemed almost solid. She could feel the grit on her teeth. Her stomach clenched. This wasn't a shelter. It was a grave, a vast forgotten tomb where dreams and people had come to die. She felt a wave of vertigo, as if she were standing on the edge of a precipice. The darkness below filled with the ghosts of forgotten laborers. Then, the sounds began to register, emerging from the initial shock-induced silence. Above them, the wind moaned as it tore through the gaping holes in the roof, a low, mournful chorus that sounded disturbingly like human whispers. Elena felt a shiver crawl up her spine, a primal fear of the unseen. From a dark corner came a relentless, maddeningly rhythmic sound. Drip, drip, drip. It was the sound of the building slowly dissolving, returning to the earth, and beneath that, a more sinister noise. The frantic, dry scuttling of unseen creatures within the walls and under the floorboards. Rats, probably. Hundreds of them. Her heart began to pound a frantic, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She held her breath, straining her ears. The silence between the sounds was even worse, heavy and expectant. It felt as if the entire structure was holding its breath, waiting for them to make a single wrong move. A feeling of being watched, of an ancient and hostile presence, crept over her, raising the fine hairs on her arms and neck. The smell was the next assault on her senses, a complex symphony of decay that threatened to make her gag. It wasn't just the damp, earthy scent of mold that clung to the air like a wet shroud. Underneath it was the sharp, metallic tang of rusting machinery, a cold and sterile odor. Intermingled with that was the acrid, pungent stink of decades of rat and pigeon droppings, a smell so sharp it burned the inside of her nose. And over it all lay the thick, chalky perfume of the dust itself, the smell of time and stillness and death. She pressed the collar of her thin coat over her nose and mouth, but it did little to stop the miasma from seeping in. A wave of nausea, hot and acidic, rose in her throat. She swallowed hard, forcing it down, her stomach roiling in protest. It was the smell of utter abandonment, the scent of a place that the world had not only forgotten, but had actively turned its back on. She felt a deep, visceral revulsion, as if the air itself were poison, slowly seeping into their lungs. Leo, however, was quiet. He clung to her leg, his small body tense, but when she shone the flashlight on his face, his eyes were wide with a strange mix of fear and wonder. "It's like a haunted castle, Mom," he whispered, his small voice swallowed by the immense space. The innocence of his words was a knife twisting in her gut. She had to force her own terror down, to be the mother he needed, the protector he believed her to be. "It is, sweetie," she lied, her voice sounding thin and hollow. "It's our secret castle. No one knows we're here." The words were meant to be a comfort, but they tasted like ash in her mouth. A secret castle, or a secret tomb. She felt a profound sense of shame. She had brought her son to a ruin, a place of filth and danger, and was trying to dress it up as an adventure. Her heart ached with the weight of the lie, a lie she knew she would have to keep telling to shield him not just from the cold and the dark, but from the crushing depth of her own despair. Yet, as she looked around at the decay, a single, stubborn thought began to form, a fragile splinter of hope in the overwhelming darkness. This place, as horrific as it was, had 4 walls. It had a roof, albeit a broken one. They were out of the wind. They were out of sight. On the street, they were vulnerable, exposed to every danger, every judgmental stare. Here, in the belly of this dead giant, they were invisible. They were ghosts. The thought was both terrifying and strangely comforting. This attic wasn't an inheritance or a gift. It was a stolen moment, a desperate, secret burrow where they might survive. If they could just stay hidden, just for a little while, she could find work. A few dollars cleaning a diner, washing dishes, anything. The attic wasn't a home, it was a hiding place. And right now, a hiding place was the only thing in the world that mattered. This grim, filthy space was the difference between a slim chance and no chance at all. She clung to that thought with the last of her strength. With a deep, shuddering breath that filled her lungs with dust, Elena knew she had to act. They couldn't just sit here and freeze. The first task was to create a space, a small island of relative order in the vast ocean of filth. Using the side of her worn shoe and her bare, freezing hands, she began to sweep a small section of the floorboards clear. A thick cloud of dust billowed up, choking her, making her eyes water and her throat raw. The grime was thick and greasy, clinging to her skin. She worked grimly, methodically, pushing aside shattered glass, clumps of hardened muck, and the brittle, skeletal remains of long-dead pigeons. It was a pathetic, almost hopeless gesture, but it was an action. It was a fight. After a few minutes of exhausting work, she had cleared a space barely larger than a coffin. She took off her own thin coat, the only barrier she had against the cold, and laid it on the grimy wood. "Here, Leo," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "This is your bed for tonight." He didn't complain. He just curled up on the coat, pulling his knees to his chest. From a broken window nearby, a jagged hole framing the night, Elena could see the world they had left behind. The view was a panorama of industrial decay. The skeletal frames of other abandoned factories stood like rusted dinosaurs against the bruised purple sky. In the far distance, the city glowed, a hazy, indifferent nebula of orange and white light. It seemed 1,000,000 miles away, a different planet she had been exiled from. That distant glow was a world of warm beds, hot meals and lit rooms, a world that had no place for her and her son. The sight filled her with a profound and aching sense of isolation. They weren't just in a forgotten attic. They were on an island of ruin, surrounded by a sea of apathy. No one was coming for them. No one even knew they were here. The cold metal frame of the window felt like ice against her hand. A sudden gust of wind howled through the opening, carrying with it the distant, mournful sound of a train horn, a lonely cry that echoed the hollowness she felt inside. As the hours crawled by, the cold intensified its assault. It was no longer just a discomfort. It was a physical enemy, relentless and invasive. It seeped up from the floorboards, radiating from the brick walls and pouring down from the holes in the roof. Elena felt it settle deep into her bones, making her joints ache with a dull, throbbing pain. She huddled next to Leo, wrapping her arms around his small, shivering body, trying desperately to share what little warmth she had left. His teeth chattered softly, a sound that pierced her heart with every click. She rubbed his back and arms, trying to create some friction, some semblance of heat. Her own body felt sluggish, her fingers and toes numb and useless. The cold made her thoughts slow and heavy. It felt like a weight, pressing down on them, trying to still their hearts and drain the last vestiges of life. She imagined it as a living thing, a hungry predator stalking them in the darkness, and she knew it was a battle they were losing. To conserve the precious batteries in her flashlight, Elena finally clicked it off. The darkness that rushed in was absolute. It was a physical, suffocating presence, a blackness so complete it felt as it had weight and texture. Her eyes, straining for any sliver of light, found none. She was blind. The loss of sight amplified every other sense. Every groan of the old building's timbers sounded like a footstep. Every gust of wind rattling the loose metal sheeting sounded like a voice whispering just outside her hearing. Her imagination, fueled by fear and exhaustion, ran wild. She pictured the scurrying rats, their eyes gleaming in the dark. She imagined the floorboards giving way, plunging them into the abyss below. A profound claustrophobia set in, even in the vastness of the attic. The darkness was a cage, and her own mind was the monster locked inside it with her. She reached out, her hand trembling, until she felt the small, warm shape of her son beside her. He was the only real thing in the suffocating black. The gnawing emptiness in her stomach had become a sharp, cramping pain. Hunger was no longer a background noise. It was a demanding, agonizing presence. She hadn't eaten a real meal in 2 days, and Leo had only had a stale granola bar yesterday afternoon. He stirred beside her, murmuring in his sleep, "I'm hungry, Mom." The words, so simple and innocent, were like a physical blow. She felt a fresh wave of shame and failure wash over her. "We'll eat first thing in the morning, sweetie," she whispered into the darkness, the lie a bitter poison on her tongue. A big breakfast. Her own stomach twisted in a violent cramp, a brutal reminder of their reality. She had nothing, no food, and only a few dollars that couldn't possibly stretch to cover both a meal and a path out of this mess. She closed her eyes, trying to ignore the pain, but it was relentless. It was a constant, physical manifestation of her poverty, a cruel internal clock ticking towards a desperate, unknown endpoint. Her mind, unable to rest, began to drift back, replaying the cascade of failures that had led her to this cold, dark floor. She saw her husband's face, his smile lines crinkling around his eyes as he promised he'd be home early for dinner. Then the phone call, the robotic voice of the foreman, the sterile white walls of the hospital waiting room. The mountain of bills had grown faster than the weeds on a grave. The crisp, formal language of the lawyers from the construction company, denying all liability. An unfortunate accident. Then the eviction notice, the cold finality of the changed lock. Each memory was a station of the cross on her journey to this hell. She felt a deep, hollow ache in her chest, the pain of a life stolen not by one single tragedy, but by 1,000 tiny, cruel cuts of a cold and uncaring system. She was utterly, completely alone. The feeling was a physical weight, pressing down on her, crushing the air from her lungs. She was just a statistic, a rounding error in the city's ledger. She listened to the building around her, to its tired, ancient language. The long, low groan of a main support beam settling under the strain of a century of neglect. The sigh of the wind through 1,000 cracks in the mortar, the shudder that ran through the entire structure when a particularly strong gust hit. It felt less like a building and more like a great, dying beast, breathing its last, slow breaths. She thought of her grandmother, a young woman with strong hands and a fierce spirit, working in this very building when it was alive, filled with the thunderous roar of looms and the shouts and laughter of hundreds of workers. She tried to imagine the life that once filled this space, the energy, the purpose. The contrast with the current silence and decay was a chasm. It felt like a personal insult, a desecration of her own history. Her family had given their sweat and youth to this place, and its reward was to offer her a tomb for a shelter. A cold fury mixed with her despair. For a terrifying moment, the thought of surrender became a seductive whisper in her mind. What if she just stopped fighting? What if she took Leo by the hand, walked out of the mill, and simply lay down on the frozen ground? Let the cold take them. Let it be over. The exhaustion was so profound, so bone-deep, that the idea of an ending, any ending, held a sweet, perverse appeal. No more hunger, no more fear, no more lies. Her resolve, which had carried her this far, crumbled into dust. Her body felt impossibly heavy, pinned to the floor by the sheer weight of her failure. Just let go. The thought was a siren's song. Why prolong the agony? The fight was unwinnable. The world had made its decision about them. They were disposable. She felt her muscles relax, a deep sigh escaping her lips. It would be so easy, so quiet. The darkness seemed to welcome the thought, to wrap around her in a cold, final embrace. It promised peace. Just as the last embers of her will to fight were about to die out, Leo made a small sound in his sleep. He shifted, turning towards her, and his small hand, warm with the innocent heat of a dreaming child, found her cheek. The simple, trusting touch was like a bolt of lightning to her soul. It cut through the fog of despair and exhaustion with searing clarity. This small, warm, breathing person beside her was not a part of her failure. He was the reason she had to succeed. His life was a sacred trust, and she was its only guardian. Giving up wasn't a release for her. It was a betrayal of him. A new strength, born not of hope, but of sheer, primal maternal instinct, surged through her veins. It was a cold, hard, unyielding force. She would not let this place, this city, this world, break her. She would get him out of here. She would get them through this night. She didn't know how. But the question of if was gone. It was replaced by a grim, unshakable when. The fight was not over. She didn't sleep. Instead, she drifted in a purgatory of hyper-vigilant exhaustion, her body limp but her mind racing. Every creak of the floorboards, every scuttling sound in the wall, jerked her into full, heart-pounding alertness. Time became a meaningless stretch of darkness, punctuated by the chattering of her own teeth and the steady, soft breaths of her son. She lay perfectly still, a sentinel in the cold, guarding her sleeping child against the real and imagined horrors of the night. After an eternity, she noticed a subtle shift in the quality of the blackness. A faint, ghostly gray began to bleed through the holes in the roof and the broken window. Dawn was coming. The weak light spread slowly, reluctantly, revealing the attic in all its wretched detail. The sleeping monsters of the night resolved back into rust-eaten machines. The vast shadows receded, exposing the true scale of the filth and decay. This was their new reality, laid bare in the unforgiving morning light. And it was even worse than she had imagined. A piercing cold, deeper than the night before, had settled into Elena's bones, making her joints feel brittle and old. She stirred from a shallow, dreamless doze, her body a single, unified ache. The first light of dawn was a weak, watery gray filtering through the grime of the broken windows, offering illumination, but no warmth. Her first thought was of Leo. She turned, her muscles protesting, and saw him still curled on her coat, his face peaceful in sleep. Her stomach gave a low, painful growl, a reminder of the desperate hunger that was her constant companion. She pushed herself into a sitting position, the rough floorboards scraping her skin, and surveyed their grim kingdom of dust and shadows. But then, a scent cut through the thick, musty air. It was impossible, unthinkable. It was the rich, dark, aromatic smell of fresh coffee. Her tired mind dismissed it as a hallucination, a cruel trick played by hunger and exhaustion, but it persisted, growing stronger, a beacon of impossible warmth in the cold, dead air. Elena's heart began to beat a frantic, panicked rhythm against her ribs. She scanned the immediate area, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. And then she saw it. On a large, dusty wooden crate not 20 feet from where they had slept, sat a small, impossible tableau. A battered metal tray. On the tray, a silver thermos, steam whispering from its spout. Beside it, a small bowl of what looked like oatmeal, a dollop of something dark melting in its center. And next to that, a loaf of bread, its crust visibly warm, a small pat of butter sweating on a piece of wax paper. It was a silent, impossible offering. A hot breakfast in a dead building. A wave of dizziness washed over her. This couldn't be real. It was a dream. She squeezed her eyes shut, then opened them again. It was still there. Her breath caught in her throat. A dry, rasping sound. They were not alone. The thought was not a comfort. It was a jolt of pure, undiluted terror. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, Elena got to her feet. Her legs felt unsteady, threatening to buckle. She took a step, then another. Her gaze locked on the tray. The most chilling detail was the dust. The thick, unbroken blanket of gray powder that covered everything remained utterly pristine. There were no footprints. None. Only her own scuffed prints from the night before, and the small area she had cleared. The path between her and the crate was a perfect, untouched canvas of decay. Whoever had left this had done so without a trace, like a ghost. A cold dread, far more chilling than the attic's temperature, seeped into her very marrow. A shiver, violent and uncontrollable, racked her body. Was this a trap? A trick from some other squatter? A territorial warning? Or was it something else, something that defied logical explanation? Her mind raced, grasping at straws, finding nothing but terrifying possibilities. The smell of the coffee was a siren's song, pulling her forward. She reached the crate, her hand trembling so badly she had to clutch it with the other to hold it steady. The warmth radiating from the thermos in the bowl was real, a palpable wave of heat against her frozen skin. She leaned closer, the scent of the oatmeal, sweet and nutty, and the yeasty perfume of the warm bread filling her senses. It was an agony of temptation. Her stomach cramped violently, a desperate physical plea. Leo stirred behind her, woken by her movement. "Mom, what is it?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep. He saw the tray and his eyes went wide. "Food!" he cried, his voice filled with a pure, uncomplicated joy that twisted a knife in Elena's heart. He scrambled to his feet and ran to her side, his small, hungry face upturned and hopeful. She felt a surge of nausea, her fear for him momentarily eclipsing her own. Was it poisoned? Was this a cruel game? But then she looked at her son's gaunt face, the dark circles under his eyes, and she knew she had no choice. They had to eat. With a shaking hand, she unscrewed the cap of the thermos. The cloud of steam that escaped was fragrant and real. She poured a small amount into the plastic cup lid and held it to her lips. It was hot, strong, and slightly sweet. The warmth hit her empty stomach like a blessing, spreading through her chest, chasing away a fraction of the deep, internal cold. It wasn't poisoned. Tears of relief and confusion pricked at her eyes. She gave the cup to Leo, who drank it greedily. Then she broke off a piece of the warm bread. It was soft, fresh. They ate in silence, ravenously, like animals. The hot oatmeal was the most substantial thing either of them had eaten in days. It was a miracle, a terrifying, inexplicable miracle. As the food filled their empty stomachs, the initial relief began to curdle back into fear. The act of kindness was so profound, so specific, that it felt more threatening than an outright attack. Someone was watching them. Someone knew they were here, knew they were hungry, and could move through this ruin like a spirit. After they had devoured every last crumb and drained the thermos, the reality of their situation settled back in, heavier than before. The hot meal, instead of providing comfort, had only amplified the strangeness of their predicament. It was an undeniable sign, a message. But what did it mean? Elena's survival instinct, sharp and honed by days of desperation, screamed at her that this was a threat, a display of power. I can reach you anytime I want. I can give you food, or I can do something else. Her heart hammered in her chest. She couldn't stay here. They couldn't just wait for the ghost to bring them dinner. She had to know. She had to understand the source of this impossible charity. The fear was a cold, hard knot in her gut, but it was overshadowed by a new, fierce determination. She would not be a passive victim in this strange, silent play. She would find the puppeteer. She had to protect her son. The mystery of the breakfast had transformed the attic from a simple, if wretched, shelter into a puzzle box she had to solve. Her search began with the dust. It was the only clue, the only anomaly in this perfectly preserved tomb. She crouched down, her eyes inches from the floor, examining the area around the crate. The dust was thick, like a layer of gray velvet, completely undisturbed except for the perfect circular impression where the tray had been. Her mind spun, maybe from the ceiling. She looked up. The holes in the roof were 30 feet above, surrounded by dangling splinters of wood and rusted metal. No one could have lowered the tray from there without dislodging a cascade of debris. The dust around the crate would have been littered with it. Her gaze swept the vast, shadowy space. The walls were solid brick, the floorboards ancient and groaning. There were no hidden panels she could see, no secret doors visible to the naked eye. It was a perfect anchor's sealed box, and yet someone had gotten in, left their offering, and vanished without a single footprint. A feeling of profound unease crept over her, the feeling of being confronted with something that operated outside the known rules of the world. She started to walk the perimeter of the vast room, her flashlight beam cutting a nervous path ahead of her. She forced herself to be methodical, to ignore the frantic beating of her heart. She ran her hands along the cold brick walls, feeling for any loose stones or hidden levers, her fingers coming away black with soot and grime. The scuttling sounds within the walls seemed to mock her, a hidden audience to her futile search. Every shadow seemed to writhe and shift just at the edge of her vision, and the constant drip, drip, drip from the far corner of the attic felt like a ticking clock, counting down to some unknown event. The sheer size of the space was overwhelming, a labyrinth of decaying machinery and forgotten detritus. It was a hopeless task. She was about to give up, to concede that the mystery was beyond her, when her gaze fell back to the crate where the tray had been. There was something she had missed. It wasn't what was there, but what was nearby. She felt a prickle of intuition, a faint signal cutting through the static of her fear. The crate had been placed just a few feet from a section of the main brick wall. As she stared at it, she began to notice a subtle inconsistency she hadn't seen before. It wasn't the dust on the floor that was the clue. It was the dust on the wall itself. In most places, the grime was a uniform, thick coating, but in a rectangular section about 3 feet wide and 5 feet high, the pattern was different. It was subtly disturbed, streaked in faint vertical lines, as if it had been brushed or wiped, not recently, but long ago. And near the bottom of this section, at ankle height, the thick layer of floor dust wasn't perfectly flat. It was slightly, almost imperceptibly, mounded against the base of the wall, as if something had been pushed, scraping the dust into a tiny ridge. Her breath caught in her chest. Her heart began to pound, a heavy, painful drumming. She knelt, her knees cracking in the cold silence, and reached out a trembling hand towards the wall. The bricks were cold and gritty to the touch, the mortar between them crumbling like dry sand. She pushed gently against the section with the disturbed dust. Nothing. She pushed harder, her muscles straining. Still solid. Her initial surge of hope began to wane, turning into the familiar bitterness of disappointment. It was nothing, just another shadow, another trick of the light. But her desperation wouldn't let her stop. She moved her hands over the surface, pressing each brick individually, 1, 2, 10, 20 bricks, all solid as the day they were laid. Then, her fingers found it, a single brick, low to the ground, that shifted. It only moved a fraction of an inch, a tiny, almost imperceptible give, but it was there. A jolt like an electric shock shot up her arm. It was real. This was it. Her fingers numb with cold, fumbled at the edges of the brick, trying to get a purchase. She dug her chipped nails into the crumbling mortar, scraping her skin. But she didn't feel the pain. With a final desperate wrench, the brick came loose. It was heavy in her hand. Behind it was not more brick, but a dark, hollow space, and in that space, a small, rusted metal ring. Her heart felt like it was going to explode. This was a lock, a release. It had been here all along, hidden in plain sight. She hooked her fingers through the cold, rough ring and pulled. For a moment, nothing happened. The mechanism was rusted solid by decades of disuse. She braced her feet against the floor and pulled with all her strength, her body screaming in protest. A low, groaning, scraping sound echoed through the attic, the sound of stone grinding against stone. It was terrifyingly loud. She froze, listening, her ears straining for any other sound, any sign that she had alerted the phantom watching them. But there was only the wind and the dripping water. Gathering her courage, she pulled again. The entire section of wall, the part with the disturbed dust, began to pivot inwards, revealing a sliver of absolute, impenetrable blackness. A wave of cold, musty air washed over her face, carrying a smell she hadn't encountered before. It was the scent of a sealed space, of stagnant air, old fabric, and something else. The dry, papery smell of time itself. The opening was just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. It led into a small, dark chamber hidden within the massive outer wall of the mill. "Leo, stay right here. Don't move," she whispered, her voice tight and strained. He just nodded, his eyes wide saucers of fear. She clicked on her flashlight, its weak beam seeming to be swallowed by the oppressive darkness within. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she squeezed through the opening. The air inside was freezing and still. Her flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing a space no larger than a walk-in closet. It was a secret room, a hermit cell, hidden away from the world for decades. The discovery sent a fresh wave of shivers down her spine. The mystery of the breakfast was leading her deeper and deeper into the unknown. The flashlight beam trembled in her hand as she panned it across the small room. Against the far wall was a simple cot, little more than a canvas sling stretched over a rusted metal frame. On it lay a thin, moth-eaten blanket, folded neatly, as if its owner had just stepped out for a moment and planned to return. The sight of that blanket, a small touch of order in the midst of decay, was deeply unsettling. It implied a long-term occupant, someone who had lived in this hidden tomb. A small, rickety wooden stool stood beside the cot. This wasn't just a hiding place, it was a home, of a sort. A profound sense of trespassing washed over her. She was invading someone's private world, a space sealed off from time. She felt a pang of guilt, but the driving need to understand her situation, to protect her son, was stronger. Who would live like this, and why? The questions multiplied, each one more disturbing than the last. This hidden room was not an answer. It was the beginning of a much darker story. Her light swept past the cot and fell upon the only other object in the room. Sitting on the dusty concrete floor, tucked into a corner as if to conceal it even further, was a rusty metal lockbox. It was about the size of a shoebox, its surface pitted and stained with orange-brown corrosion. It wasn't large, but it looked heavy, solid. Her heart gave a powerful leap. This was it. This had to be the reason for the secret room, the heart of the mystery. For a wild, hopeful moment, her mind filled with fantasies. Gold, jewelry, a hidden fortune left by some eccentric factory owner. Enough to get her and Leo out of this nightmare, to start a new life. The thought was so powerful, so seductive, that it almost made her dizzy. It was the desperate hope of a drowning person seeing a piece of driftwood. She approached the box slowly, her worn shoes making no sound on the dusty floor. It was the focal point of the room, radiating a silent, potent energy. She knelt beside the box, her knees protesting on the cold concrete. She ran her fingers over its rough, cold surface. The metal was pitted and uneven, and the latch was a solid piece of rusted iron. There was a small keyhole, also clogged with rust and time. Of course, it was locked. Her brief fantasy of a quick salvation evaporated, replaced by a grim frustration. She shook the box gently. It was heavy, and the contents shifted with a soft, dense, muffled thud. It wasn't the clink of coins or the rattle of jewels. It was a dull, solid sound. Disappointment, sharp and familiar, pricked at her. Still, she had to get it open. She looked around the small cell. There was nothing. Just the cot, the stool, the box. She returned to the main attic, her mind racing. She needed a tool, a lever. Her eyes scanned the debris-strewn floor. After a few frantic moments of searching, she found it. A long, thin piece of rusted metal, probably a broken part from one of the looms. It was heavy and sharp on one end. It would have to do. Returning to the hidden room, she wedged the sharp end of the metal bar into the seam of the lockbox, just above the latch. She put all of her weight on it, grunting with the effort. The old metal groaned in protest, but it held fast. She repositioned the bar and tried again, leveraging it with a rock she'd found. Sweat beaded on her forehead, mingling with the grime on her skin. Her muscles burned. The only sounds were her own ragged breaths and the screech of metal against metal. It felt like she was trying to break into a tomb. Then, with a sudden, deafening crack that echoed like a gunshot in the tiny room, the latch gave way. The lid sprung open a few inches. Elena froze, her body rigid, every nerve ending screaming. She held her breath, listening. Had anyone heard? The silence that answered was absolute, broken only by the frantic thumping of her own heart. She waited a full minute, her ears straining before she allowed herself to move again. Slowly, reverently, she reached out and lifted the heavy lid. The hinges shrieked in protest. A wave of dry, musty air rose from the box, the smell of old paper and fading ink, a scent that spoke of long-forgotten secrets. Her flashlight beam pierced the darkness inside, and her heart sank. There was no gold, no glittering jewels. Her desperate fantasy of a hidden fortune died a quiet, painful death. Instead, the box was filled to the brim with paper. On top lay a small, leather-bound book, its cover cracked and faded with age. A diary. Beneath it, she could see several thick, heavy books, their spines labeled with neat, handwritten tags. They were financial ledgers. Her disappointment was so profound it felt like a physical blow. Just old paper. Worthless junk. She felt a fool for her brief, wild hope. The mystery had led her to nothing but a box of trash. She slumped back on her heels, the adrenaline draining out of her, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness. It was all for nothing. The terrifying breakfast, the frantic search, breaking into this secret tomb, all for a pile of musty old accounting books. She almost closed the lid, ready to abandon the whole thing, to just take her son and flee into the cold anonymity of the city. But something stopped her. The diary. Her fingers traced the cracked leather of its cover. It felt personal, intimate, a container not of wealth, but of a life. Who would go to such lengths to hide a diary and some business ledgers? Why seal them in a hidden room behind a brick wall? There was no money here, but the care taken to hide these objects suggested they were valuable in a different way. Dangerous, even. The initial disappointment began to shift, replaced by a dawning, chilling realization. This wasn't treasure. This was evidence. Her fingers, still trembling slightly, closed around the small diary. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, dense with pages. She lifted it from the box. The leather was cool and smooth in some places, rough and brittle in others. It felt ancient, a relic from another time. She carefully opened the cover. On the first page, written in a neat, spidery script of faded blue ink, was a name and a date. Robert Miller. Accounting. January 1972. The date sent a chill through her. 50 years ago. A lifetime. This book held the thoughts of a man who was likely long dead. She felt a sudden, profound connection to him. This stranger who had lived and worked in this hidden room. She was holding a piece of his soul. A ghost made of paper and ink. The mystery of the breakfast had faded, replaced by the much larger, more personal mystery of Robert Miller. Who was he, and what secrets had he been so desperate to protect? She flipped through the pages. Most were filled with that same neat, meticulous handwriting, detailing daily events, observations, thoughts. Then her eyes caught a specific entry, the handwriting suddenly more frantic, the ink darker as if the pen had been pressed hard against the page. "Alistair is a monster," it read. "The Union talks have him spooked. He talks of fire, not as a risk, but as a tool, an opportunity. God help us all." The words leaped off the page, charged with a palpable fear. Alistair. Elena vaguely remembered the name from her grandmother's stories. Alistair Finch, the original owner of the mill, the man who had built this empire of brick and thread. A knot of dread tightened in Elena's stomach. This was no ordinary diary. This was a confession, an accusation, a warning from half a century ago. The air in the small room suddenly felt colder, heavier, charged with the energy of a long-buried crime. Underneath the diary were the ledgers. She lifted one out. It was heavy, its pages filled with neat columns of numbers and descriptions. Most of it was standard accounting, payroll, supply costs. But then she saw a separate section at the back. It was titled A.F. Special Accounts. The entries were different, vague descriptions next to huge sums of money. Municipal Safety Inspection Review, $10,000. Fire Marshal Consultation Fee, $15,000. Disposal Contract, expedited, $20,000. The dates all clustered in the late summer of 1972, just months after the diary entry about fire. A cold, sickening realization began to dawn on her. The numbers didn't feel like business expenses. They felt like payoffs, bribes. This wasn't just paper. This was proof. The diary was the story, and these ledgers were the receipts. She felt the weight of the book in her hands, no longer as paper and cardboard, but as a heavy, dangerous truth. The lockbox didn't contain a fortune. It contained something far more volatile. It contained a story of a horrific crime. She now understood why it was hidden so carefully. This wasn't just a man's private thoughts. It was a bomb, waiting for half a century to be detonated. The mysterious breakfast, the hidden room. It all clicked into place in a terrifying way. Whoever was watching her, whoever had led her here, hadn't just given her a meal. They had given her this. They had passed a torch, a terrible burden of knowledge. She felt a wave of absolute terror. This was not her fight. She was a cleaning lady, a desperate mother trying to survive. What was she supposed to do with the evidence of a 50-year-old crime? Going to the police was a fantasy. They would laugh at her. A homeless squatter, or worse, arrest her for trespassing. And if this Alistair Finch had been powerful enough to bribe officials then, what about his family now? She looked from the diary to the ledgers, her mind reeling. The initial mystery of who left the food had been eclipsed by the terrifying mystery contained within these pages. She was sitting in the dark, in a hidden tomb, holding the evidence of a conspiracy, perhaps even murder. A deep, primal instinct told her to put it all back, to close the box, slide the wall back into place, and run, take Leo and disappear. Forget she ever saw any of it. It was too big, too dangerous. This was a secret that had stayed buried for 50 years for a reason, a secret that people were likely willing to kill to protect. The silence of the attic no longer felt empty. It felt watchful. The weight of the decision pressed down on her, crushing the air from her lungs. For the first time since entering the mill, she was afraid not of the cold or the rats or the darkness, but of the living, breathing danger she now held in her hands. The full weight of her discovery settled upon her like a physical shroud. She wasn't just a squatter anymore. She was a witness to a crime committed before she was born, but whose echoes were now reverberating through this dusty, forgotten space. The ledgers in the diary were not just objects. They were a voice from the grave, a voice that had been deliberately silenced and entrusted to this hidden chamber. And now, through some impossible twist of fate, she was its new keeper. She felt the cold concrete beneath her, the chill seeping into her bones. But it was nothing compared to the icy dread that was flooding her veins. This knowledge was a poison. It changed everything. She could no longer see the attic as a neutral shelter. It was a crime scene. And by finding this box, she had placed herself and her son directly in the center of it. The questions were no longer about who left the breakfast, but who would come looking for what she had just found. She thought of Leo, sleeping peacefully just a few yards away, blissfully unaware of the hornet's nest she had just kicked. Her first, most powerful instinct was to protect him. And protection, her mind screamed, meant ignorance. It meant putting these books back, sealing the room, and running as fast as their legs could carry them. She could take the $50, get on a bus to nowhere, and disappear. It was the sensible thing to do, the sane thing to do. But then she thought of the frantic handwriting in the diary. God help us all. The words of a man terrified, a man trying to do the right thing in the face of pure evil. He had hidden this evidence at great personal risk. To ignore his plea, to let his effort be for nothing, felt like a betrayal, a profound cowardice. She was caught in an impossible bind, torn between the primal urge to protect her child and a nascent, terrifying sense of duty to a ghost. With a final, decisive movement, she closed the ledgers and placed the diary carefully on top. She did not put them back in the box. Instead, she tucked the small, leather-bound diary into the inside pocket of her coat, where it rested against her chest like a cold, hard second heart. She gathered the heavy ledgers in her arms, their weight a solid, undeniable burden. She couldn't leave them here. She didn't know what she was going to do, what any of this meant, but she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her soul that she could not leave this truth behind. Leaving the lockbox open and empty, she squeezed back out of the secret room into the main attic, the heavy books clutched to her chest. The weak morning light seemed brighter now, harsher. The shadows seemed darker, more menacing. The world had shifted on its axis, and she knew, with a chilling certainty, that her desperate search for shelter had led her to a danger far greater than starvation or cold. Huddled in the relative shelter of the secret room's opening, Elena felt the chill of the story seep into her more profoundly than the cold of the attic itself. She had placed the heavy ledgers into her frayed backpack, the weight a constant, terrifying reminder of the burden she now carried. Leo was asleep again, his small body curled on her coat, his innocence a fragile shield against the horrors she was uncovering. With trembling fingers, she held the small leather diary, the flashlight's weak beam illuminating the spidery ink. The air felt thick, heavy with unspoken history, and every gust of wind whistling through the broken roof sounded like a whisper from the past. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, a rhythm of pure dread. She was no longer just hiding from poverty. She was now hiding with a secret, a ghost story written in ink and blood, and she could feel the weight of its 50-year silence pressing down on her, demanding to be broken, threatening to shatter her fragile world in the process. This was a truth that had been buried alive, and she had just handed it a shovel. She opened the diary to the marked page, her breath misting in the cold air. The bookkeeper, Robert Miller, wrote with a chilling clarity that made the events feel immediate, as if they were happening just beyond the brick walls. August 12, 1972. The heat is unbearable, but it is the tension that suffocates. Alistair Finch walks the floor like a caged predator. The union vote is tomorrow. I saw him in the boiler room with two men I did not recognize. They carried canisters. The smell of gasoline was faint but unmistakable. He smiled when he saw me, a smile that did not reach his eyes, a smile of pure ice. Elena felt a wave of nausea. She could almost smell the faint chemical tang in the air, a phantom scent from half a century ago. She looked over at Leo, a fierce, protective instinct washing over her. She was reading a testament of evil, and the evil felt palpable, a living presence in the decaying mill, coiled and waiting. The diary was no longer just paper. It was a window into the last hours of innocent men, and she felt like a voyeur to a murder. She forced herself to read on, her finger tracing the frantic, looping script of the next entry, dated the following night. They did it. My God, they did it. He called a mandatory meeting for the union organizers in the South Wing warehouse. I saw him slip the bolt on the main door himself. Then the alarm, the smell of smoke, thick and black, the screams. I will hear those screams until the day I die. It was a chorus of the damned. Fire trucks arrived late, their sirens a mournful, useless cry. The official report will say it was faulty wiring, an accident. But I know. I saw the ledger, I saw the payments. He purchased their silence. Elena's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a sob. The sheer, calculated cruelty of it stole her breath, locking them in. It wasn't just fraud. It was a massacre. She could picture the scene with horrifying clarity. The smoke, the panic, the desperate hands beating against a bolted door. The dust motes dancing in her flashlight beam seemed to take on the form of souls, trapped and restless in this vast mausoleum. The full, monstrous scope of the conspiracy unfurled as she cross-referenced the diary with the ledgers she had pulled from her bag. The AF Special Accounts section was a meticulous record of evil. T. O'Malley, Fire Marshal, $15,000. Chief Brody, LPD, $20,000. The names were there, pillars of the community. Their integrity bought and paid for. The final entry in the diary was almost illegible. The handwriting shaky, desperate. He knows I know. His eyes follow me. I have hidden this. It is all I can do. Forgive my cowardice. Remember their names? Garcia, Petrov, Sullivan, Jones. The list went on, a roll call of the dead. Elena felt tears, hot and silent, stream down her cold, grimy cheeks. They were tears of rage, of pity, of profound, terrifying responsibility. Robert Miller hadn't been a coward. He had been a hero, creating a time bomb of truth and hiding it, hoping one day someone like her, someone with nothing to lose, would finally light the fuse. The weight in her bag was no longer a burden. It was an obligation. Suddenly, a sound from below shattered the silence. It was not the familiar groan of the old building or the scuttling of rats. It was sharp, metallic, and deliberate. The slam of a car door. Elena's blood ran cold. She instantly clicked off her flashlight, plunging the attic back into its gray, shadowy gloom. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she was afraid it was audible. She held her breath, straining her ears, every nerve ending on fire. Leo stirred, and she placed a hand gently on his chest, a silent plea for him to stay quiet. Then came another sound, a sound that confirmed her worst fears. The crunch of expensive shoes on the broken glass of the factory's ground floor. This was no ghost. This was not the kind stranger who left them breakfast. This was something else. A predator had entered their hiding place, and they were trapped, 4 stories up, with a secret that could get them killed. A primal animal panic seized her. She felt an overwhelming urge to grab Leo and run, but there was nowhere to go. Slowly, methodically, she shoved the ledgers and the diary deep into her backpack, pushing it into the darkest corner behind a rusted, monolithic piece of machinery. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely function. Every movement seemed impossibly loud. The footsteps were closer now, ascending the groaning metal stairs. They were not the hesitant steps of an explorer or a fellow squatter. They were heavy, confident, and rhythmic. The sound of ownership, the sound of power. A feeling of utter helplessness washed over her. She was a mouse in a maze, and the owner had just entered the room. She scrambled back to Leo, pulling the thin blanket over both of them, trying to make them as small and insignificant as possible. She pressed her face against his hair, inhaling his familiar childhood scent, a desperate anchor in a sea of terror. "Stay quiet," she breathed into his ear, her voice a choked, terrified whisper. "No matter what, stay quiet." The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. The attic door creaked open. A tall, broad silhouette stood framed in the doorway, blocking the weak light, casting a long, ominous shadow that stretched across the dusty floor like a grasping hand. For a moment, the figure just stood there, surveying the vast, decaying space. Elena could feel his gaze sweeping over the attic, and she held her breath, praying they would blend into the shadows, that they would be mistaken for just another pile of forgotten refuse. But the silence stretched on, heavy and expectant. The figure took a step inside, and the smell of expensive wool and a sharp, clean cologne cut through the musty air, an alien scent in this world of decay. It was the scent of money and power, a smell so out of place it felt like a physical violation. Elena's heart pounded in her throat. She felt exposed, pinned by the unseen gaze of the intruder. The game was over. They had been found. The silence was finally broken by a voice, a low, smooth baritone that rumbled with authority. "I know someone is in here. You can come out." Slowly, knowing there was no other choice, Elena pushed the blanket aside and got to her feet, shielding Leo behind her. Her legs felt like jelly. The man's eyes, cold and gray as a winter sky, locked onto hers. He was in his late 60s, with a full head of perfectly coiffed silver hair. He wore a tailored charcoal overcoat over a dark suit, his leather shoes gleaming even in the dim light. He looked less like a man and more like a monument, carved from granite and arrogance. His face was a mask of calculated composure, but his eyes were sharp, intelligent, and utterly devoid of warmth. They missed nothing. He took in her ragged clothes, her grimy face, and Leo cowering behind her. A flicker of something, annoyance, disgust, crossed his features before being instantly replaced by a placid, unreadable expression. He was the complete antithesis of this place, a creature of boardrooms and clean, orderly power, and his very presence here felt like a desecration of the quiet decay. He was Alistair Finch's son. She knew it in her bones. The man took another step closer, his gaze sweeping past her to the area where the mysterious breakfast had been left, then to the wall with the secret room. He noticed the scuff marks on the floor, the disturbed dust near the loose bricks. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes, but when he spoke, his voice was unnervingly calm, even gentle. "My name is Arthur Finch," he said, the name hanging in the air like a death sentence. "My company owns this property." He gestured vaguely at the ruin around them. "As you can see, the building is not safe. My security team informed me there were trespassers. I came to see for myself." He gave a thin paternal smile that didn't touch his cold eyes. It was a predator's smile, all teeth and no warmth. Elena's entire body went rigid. The name confirmed her terror. This was him, the heir to the massacre, the man with everything to lose if the truth she now carried in her backpack ever saw the light of day. Her silence was a wall he couldn't seem to read. He continued his performance of concern, his voice dripping with false empathy. "You have a child. This is no place for a child. There are rats, disease, structural instability. I can't, in good conscience, allow you to stay here." He spoke as if he were a concerned landlord, not the son of a mass murderer standing on the grounds of his father's greatest crime. The hypocrisy was so profound it made Elena feel dizzy. She felt a hot surge of rage, a desperate desire to scream the names from the diary at him, to throw the ledgers at his feet and watch his mask of civility shatter. But the sight of Leo, his small hand gripping her jeans, his face pale with fear, froze the words in her throat. She was powerless. A word from this man could have her arrested. A gesture could have them thrown back onto the street. Or worse. She felt trapped, her fury and fear warring within her, rendering her completely silent and still. She could only stare at him, her heart a block of ice in her chest. Arthur Finch seemed to take her silence as acquiescence or perhaps stupidity. He reached into his overcoat and pulled out a thick, folded stack of $100 bills, held together by a gold money clip. He fanned the bills slightly. It was more money than Elena had seen in her entire life. "I understand," he said, his voice softening into a tone of practiced magnanimity. "Times are hard. I want to help you. Here," he said, stepping forward and placing the stack of bills on the very same wooden crate where the breakfast had been. "A few $100, enough for a motel for a few weeks, some hot meals, a bus ticket to somewhere new, maybe. All I ask is that you take your son and be gone within the hour. No questions asked, just a simple transaction between us." The money sat there, a neat green rectangle of salvation on the dusty crate. It was a way out, an immediate end to the hunger, the cold, the terror. The temptation was a physical force, pulling at her, whispering of safety and warmth. Her eyes were fixed on the money. $300. 4. It was impossible to tell. It was enough. Enough to escape this attic, this city, this entire nightmare. She could buy Leo new shoes. She could sleep in a real bed tonight, feel the glorious heat of a hot shower on her skin. She could eat until her stomach ached from fullness, not from emptiness. The vision was so powerful, so seductive, it almost brought her to her knees. This was the lifeline she had been praying for. All she had to do was take it. All she had to do was agree to forget. Forget the diary in her bag. Forget the names of the dead. Forget the screams that echoed in the ink of Robert Miller's confession. The choice was brutally simple, her son's immediate safety versus the justice for ghosts. Her stomach twisted into a knot. The feeling of the diary against her chest was a cold, rectangular accusation. She didn't move. She couldn't. She was paralyzed by the weight of the decision. Her hesitation seemed to annoy him. The thin veil of pleasantry dropped from his face, and his eyes hardened into chips of slate. The air grew thick and heavy. "And this is a very generous offer," he said, his voice losing its gentle edge, replaced by a low, threatening timbre. "I suggest you take it. This building is scheduled for demolition, expedited demolition. It begins in a matter of days. The crews will be here soon, and they won't be as understanding as I am." He took a deliberate step closer, invading her personal space, his height and bulk making her feel small and fragile. He was no longer offering, he was commanding. The shift in his demeanor was terrifying. It was a glimpse of the real man behind the mask, the man who had inherited not just his father's fortune, but his ruthlessness. The silence stretched between them, taut and humming with unspoken threats. Elena could feel Leo trembling behind her, and her protective instincts screamed at her to just take the money and run. But she remained frozen, her gaze locked with his. A flicker of suspicion crossed his face. He glanced again toward the hidden wall. "You need to understand," he said, his voice now a low, menacing whisper that was far more terrifying than a shout. "Old buildings like this, they're unpredictable, unsafe. Terrible accidents can happen on demolition sites." He let the words hang in the air, each one a polished stone of menace. Gas leaks, small fires, structural collapse. Things fall. People who aren't supposed to be here, trespassers, they can get hurt, badly. It would be a tragedy if someone, especially a child, were to get caught in the way of progress. The threat was no longer veiled. It was laid bare, cold and sharp as a shard of broken glass. He was telling her that if she didn't take the money and disappear, he would make her disappear. The accidental fire that killed the Union men suddenly felt like a blueprint. He held her gaze for a moment longer, a silent assertion of his power, then turned without another word and walked away. His confident footsteps echoed on the metal stairs as he descended, the sound fading until it was replaced once more by the mournful sigh of the wind. Elena was left alone, her body trembling uncontrollably, her mind screaming. On the crate sat a fortune, a path to survival, a quiet escape. In her backpack was a story of murder, a demand for justice, a path to almost certain danger. The two choices lay before her, stark and irreconcilable in the dusty gray light of the attic. Taking the money meant condemning the souls of those murdered men to eternal silence and becoming complicit in the crime. Refusing it meant declaring war on a man who held all the power, a man who wouldn't hesitate to crush her and her son to protect his family's dark legacy. What would you do in her place? Would you take the money and save your child? Or would you risk everything for a justice 50 years overdue? The silence Finch left behind was louder than any scream. It was a vacuum, pulling the warmth and air from the attic, leaving only a profound, ringing emptiness. Elena stood frozen, a statue of dust and fear, her gaze fixed on the neat stack of bills on the crate. It was a poisoned apple, a perfect, deadly illusion of safety. The scent of Finch's expensive cologne lingered in the air, a phantom of his power, a stark violation of their squalid sanctuary. Her mind replayed his final words, the casual, chilling mention of accidents, fires, and people who get hurt. It wasn't a threat, it was a promise, a statement of fact. Her heart, which had been a frantic drum, now felt like a block of ice in her chest. The money wasn't an offer of escape, it was a test, it was a leash. Taking it would mean she understood the rules of his world. Silence is bought, and the price of speaking is absolute. Every instinct screamed, but her body refused to move, pinned in place by the sheer gravity of his menace. Leo's small, trembling hand tugged on her jeans, breaking the spell. "Mommy, are we leaving?" he whispered, his voice small and fragile in the vast, hostile silence. The innocence of his question was a physical blow. He saw the money, saw a way out, a path back to a world with warm beds and full meals. How could she explain the terror that now coiled in her gut? How could she tell him that the shiny paper on the crate was more dangerous than the cold or the rats? She felt a wave of dizzying vertigo, the world tilting on its axis. The choice was a razor's edge. On one side, a handful of cash and a temporary reprieve, followed by the constant gnawing fear of being hunted. On the other, a backpack full of damning evidence and a direct confrontation with a man who treated murder as a line item on a budget. She could hear the distant, mournful sound of a siren, a sound from a world of rules and consequences that felt a million miles away from this lawless ruin where only power mattered. Her gaze fell upon her own reflection in a shard of broken window glass. The woman staring back was a stranger, wild-eyed, face streaked with grime and tears. A cornered animal. This was what Finch saw. A pathetic, disposable nuisance. It was this perception of her weakness, she realized, that might be her only weapon. He had underestimated her. He thought she could be bought for a few $100s, her conscience soothed by the promise of a motel room. He didn't know about the iron will forged in grief and poverty, the primal ferocity of a mother protecting her child. He didn't know that she held the ghost of Robert Miller inside her now, his 50-year-old fear and courage fueling her own. The money on the crate was no longer tempting. It was insulting. It was a monument to his arrogance, his belief that everything and everyone had a price. A cold, hard resolve began to crystallize in her veins, displacing the terror. She would not be bought. She would not be silenced. A new sound reached her, cutting through the oppressive silence of the mill. It wasn't the groan of the building or the rush of the wind. It was a soft, hesitant tapping. It came from far below, from the heavy side door they had first entered. Her blood ran cold. He was back. Finch had come back, his patience already worn thin. The fragile resolve she had just found shattered into 1,000 pieces of pure panic. Had he seen her hide the backpack? Was he coming to finish the transaction with force? She grabbed Leo, her hand clamped over his mouth to stifle any sound, and dragged him towards the deepest, darkest corner of the attic, behind a mountain of rusted, forgotten machinery. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic prisoner trying to escape her chest. The tapping came again, a little louder this time, followed by a voice, thin and reedy with age. That was definitely not Arthur Finch's. "Hello? Miss? Please. I saw the man leave. I'm not here to hurt you." The voice was frail, laced with an unmistakable tremor of anxiety. It was the voice of an old man. Elena's terror was momentarily replaced by a sharp, disorienting confusion. Who was this? Another ghost from the mill's past? She crept silently to a section of the floor where the boards were warped, creating a narrow crack that offered a sliver of a view to the ground floor entrance below. Her eye pressed to the gap. She could just make out a figure standing in the sliver of daylight from the partially open door. He was stooped and thin, his back bent by age, wearing a worn cardigan and holding a crumpled paper bag. He looked as fragile as a dried leaf, his head constantly turning as if he expected danger from every shadow. This was not a threat. This was not one of Finch's men. This was something else entirely. Her mind raced, trying to connect this strange new piece to the terrifying puzzle. The mystery of this place was deepening with every passing hour, pulling her further into its vortex. "My name is Santiago," the old man called up again, his voice trembling but clear. "I live across the way. I brought you the breakfast." The words hit Elena with the force of a physical blow. Her breath caught in her throat. This was him, the ghost, the silent benefactor, the one who had started this entire chain of events. A torrent of conflicting emotions washed over her: relief, anger, suspicion, and a desperate, burgeoning hope. He was real, a person of flesh and blood. He knew they were here. He had been watching them. But why? What did he want? She remained hidden, her body tense, listening. "Please, miss," he pleaded, his voice cracking with urgency. "That man, Arthur Finch, he is a devil. We need to talk. There is not much time." The mention of Finch's name, spoken with such fear and hatred, was the final push she needed. This old man was not a threat. He was an ally, perhaps the only one she had in the world. "Leo, I want you to go into the secret room," she whispered, her voice tight and urgent. "And you do not come out. Not until I come get you. Do you understand?" The boy nodded, his eyes wide with fear but also with the implicit trust that broke her heart. He squeezed through the hidden opening in the wall, disappearing into the darkness of the sealed chamber. Only when he was hidden did Elena allow herself to move. Leaving the backpack with the ledgers tucked safely in the darkness with her son, she began the terrifying descent down the groaning metal stairs. The diary was still in her coat pocket, a cold, hard rectangle against her chest. Every step echoed in the cavernous space, a declaration of her presence. She felt exposed, vulnerable. Her hand gripped the gritty, cold railing, her knuckles white. As she reached the bottom, the old man, Santiago, flinched back, as if startled by a ghost emerging from the gloom. His face, she could see now, was a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes dark and full of a deep, ancient sorrow. He stood barely 5 feet tall, his body stooped, his hands trembling as he clutched the paper bag. Up close, the fear on his face was palpable. It was a fear that had been etched there over decades, a permanent part of his features. "You have your grandmother's eyes," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. "Maria. She had that same fire in her. I knew her. I worked here, a long time ago." He gestured vaguely at the decaying factory around them. This revelation, this personal connection to her own past, chipped away at the last of Elena's suspicion. This man was a part of this place, a living piece of its history. "The breakfast," Elena said, her voice hoarse. "Why?" Santiago looked down at his worn shoes, a deep shame in his expression. "I saw you arrive, with the boy. The wind was so cold that night. I couldn't just do nothing, not again." The words "not again" hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning, hinting at a past failure that had haunted him for a lifetime. He was not just a kind stranger, he was a man seeking absolution. He looked up, his dark eyes pleading. "I was a security guard here," he confessed, the words tumbling out as if a dam had broken. "Just a boy, really. 19. On duty the night of the fire." His gaze became distant, lost in a 50-year-old memory of smoke and screams. "They paid me extra to be at the north gate, to see nothing, hear nothing. I took the money. I was young, stupid. I had a family to feed." The shame was so thick in his voice that Elena could almost taste it. He was confessing to a sin that had festered inside him for half a century. "But I heard them," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Even from across the yard I heard the screams. I've heard them every night since." He was not just an ally, he was another victim of the Finches, trapped not in a burning building but in a burning memory, a prison of guilt from which he had never escaped. Elena felt a pang of pity for this frail, haunted man, a feeling that momentarily eclipsed her own terror. "And Robert Miller?" Elena asked, her voice barely a whisper, pulling the diary from her pocket. Santiago's eyes widened at the sight of the leather-bound book, a flicker of terror and recognition in them. "You found it," he breathed, a sound of both awe and dread. He was the bookkeeper, a good man, quiet, but brave. He knew what Alistair Finch was planning. He tried to warn people, but no one would listen. He came to me a few days before the fire, his hands shaking. He said Finch was a monster. Santiago's own hands were shaking now, mirroring the ghost of Robert Miller's fear. He said if anything happened to him, to look in the wall. He showed me the loose brick. He was terrified, but he was trying to leave a witness, even if it was just paper and ink. The old man's story was weaving another thread into the tapestry of the crime, adding a layer of personal human tragedy to the cold facts of the ledger. Santiago took a ragged breath, the confession costing him a visible effort. After the fire, Miller was gone. The official story was that he'd packed up and left town, couldn't handle the tragedy. But I knew Alistair. I knew his coldness. A few days later, I was doing a final sweep before they sealed the wing. There was a smell. From the boiler room. He paused, swallowing hard, his eyes shutting as if to block out the memory. I found him, Robert, hidden behind an old furnace. His neck, it was broken. Elena gasped, her hand flying to her own throat. The bookkeeper hadn't just disappeared. He had been murdered, silenced. The secret she carried was not just about corporate greed. It was about the cold-blooded murder of a man who tried to do the right thing. The danger had just escalated exponentially. This wasn't a cold case. It was an active one, and she was the only one holding the killer's motive. I panicked, Santiago continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Even though they were alone in the vast, empty factory, I knew they would come back for him, to dispose of the body. I saw the lockbox in his coat. I knew it must be what he wanted me to find. I didn't have time. So I took it, ran to the attic, and put it back behind the bricks where he showed me. Then I ran. I quit that day, and never set foot in this place again. His confession painted a horrifying picture. A terrified 19-year-old boy, stumbling upon a murder, forced to make a split-second decision that would define the rest of his life. He hadn't been a coward. He had been a terrified child out of his depth. He hadn't run from the truth. He had preserved it. becoming its unwilling guardian, locking himself in a prison of fear just as surely as Robert Miller had been sealed in his hidden tomb. "I bought the little house across the street a few years later," he said, gesturing with a shaky hand towards the outside world. I had to watch, to make sure no one ever found it. I've been watching this place decay for 50 years. Waiting. For what? I never knew. Maybe for someone like you. Someone brave enough. Someone with nothing to lose." The words "nothing to lose" struck Elena like a physical blow. It was true. Her poverty, her desperation, the very things that made her vulnerable, were also what made her dangerous to Arthur Finch. She was outside the system he controlled, an unpredictable variable in his carefully constructed world. Santiago hadn't just been watching the mill. He had been standing vigil, a lonely sentinel guarding a tomb of secrets, waiting for a catalyst. And that catalyst, she now understood with chilling certainty, was her. When I saw him arrive today, Arthur Finch, my blood ran cold, Santiago said, his voice laced with venom. He has his father's face, the same cold eyes, the same smile that's all teeth. Alistair was the architect, but Arthur, he was the enforcer. Even back then, a young man, full of rage and entitlement. He's the one who was with his father in the boiler room that night. He's the one who bolted the door, the final piece of the puzzle slotted into place with a sickening click. Arthur Finch wasn't just covering up his father's crimes. He was covering up his own. He was a direct participant in the massacre. The man who had stood before her, offering a few $100s with a condescending smile, had the blood of innocent men on his hands. He was not just an heir, he was a murderer, and he had looked her right in the eye. A wave of pure, unadulterated loathing washed over Elena, so powerful it almost made her gag. "And now, the demolition," Santiago said, his voice dropping, his words heavy with urgency. "You heard him. Expedited demolition. It starts in 48 hours. Not in weeks, not in months. Now. Do you understand what that means?" He looked at her, his eyes wide with a desperate plea for her to grasp the final, terrifying truth. He's not clearing the way for a new building. He's burying a graveyard. He's waited 50 years for everyone to die, for every witness to fade away. Now he thinks the coast is clear. He's going to bring this whole place down, turn it to dust and rubble, and the truth will be buried forever. This is his final act. His final cleanup. The 48-hour timeline wasn't a bureaucratic detail. It was a death clock. The demolition wasn't just about a building. It was about the destruction of evidence, the final murder of the truth itself. Time had run out. The old man's story concluded, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. The entire, horrific tapestry was now laid bare. The fire, the bribes, the murders of the workers, the murder of the bookkeeper, and Arthur Finch's direct involvement in it all. The knowledge was a crushing weight. Elena looked down at her own shaking hands, then back at Santiago's pleading, terrified face. The money Finch had left on the crate upstairs seemed like a sick joke now. It was never an escape. It was a test of her complicity. If she took it and ran, he would have hunted her down. She knew that now. He could never afford to leave a loose end. A person who had been inside the mill, who might have stumbled upon the secret he was so close to burying forever. Her only path to survival was not to run from the truth, but to run with it, to get it into the light before he could extinguish her and everything she knew. A profound and terrifying clarity settled over Elena. The choice had been made for her. The moment she found that diary, her fate was sealed. She was no longer just a mother fighting for her son's survival. She was the last voice of a dozen murdered men. She was Robert Miller's final act of defiance. She was the inheritor of Santiago's 50-year vigil. The burden felt immense, capable of crushing her, but it also filled her with a strange, cold strength. The fear was still there, a knot of ice in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with a layer of pure, unyielding resolve. She looked at Santiago, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she did not feel entirely alone. She nodded, a single, decisive movement. "I have it," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "I have the diary, and the ledgers. They're safe." A flicker of something akin to hope sparked in Santiago's tired eyes, the first he'd shown. It was a fragile, terrified hope, but it was there. A pact was forged between them in the dusty, decaying heart of the factory, a bond between the grieving granddaughter and the guilt-ridden security guard. They were two ghosts, haunted by the same history, now bound to the same dangerous purpose. "We have to get it out," he whispered, his voice urgent. "Tonight. We can't wait. He'll be back. He won't trust that you'll just leave." His words confirmed the dread that was already coiling in her gut. Finch's visit wasn't the end. It was the opening move. The real attack was yet to come. "Go back upstairs," Santiago instructed, his fear giving way to a frantic, tactical energy. "Get your boy and the books. Stay hidden. I will watch from my house. If they come, I will create a diversion. A signal." He pressed the crumpled paper bag into her hands. Inside were sandwiches and 2 bottles of water, an offering for the battle to come. Elena climbed the stairs back to the attic, her legs moving with a new, grim purpose. The food from Santiago sat like a stone in her stomach. She explained to Leo in simple, hushed tones that they had to be ready to leave, that they were going to a friend's house. She retrieved the backpack from the secret room, the weight of the ledgers both a burden and a weapon. The afternoon light began to fade, the gray gloom of the attic deepening into the bruised purple of twilight. The hours crawled by, each one a small eternity. Every creak of the old building, every gust of wind, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through her. She sat with Leo in the shadows, the backpack clutched to her chest, her eyes fixed on the small house with a single lit window visible across the street. It was a tiny beacon of hope in a sea of darkness. The waiting was a unique form of torture, a slow-burning fire of anxiety and anticipation that was almost worse than the attack itself. Night fell completely, swallowing the mill in an oppressive, inky blackness. The distant city glow seemed colder, more indifferent than ever. The only light was the weak beam of her flashlight, which she used sparingly, creating a small, trembling island of visibility in the vast ocean of shadow. Leo had fallen into a fitful sleep, his head in her lap. Elena stayed awake, a sentinel in the dark, her senses strained to the breaking point. She listened. The silence was absolute, heavier and more menacing than it had ever been. It was the silence of a predator stalking its prey. Her mind conjured images of Finch's cold eyes, his smile that didn't reach them. She imagined the 2 men he was with in the boiler room, faceless thugs ready to carry out any order. Her skin crawled. The air itself felt charged, humming with a low, dangerous energy. She could feel them coming. It was not a thought, but a deep, physical certainty. Then she heard it, a car engine, approaching slowly, then cut abruptly a block away. Silence, no doors slamming, no voices, just a sudden, profound absence of sound. Her heart leaped into her throat. This was it. They were trying to be quiet. She held her breath, her ears straining, trying to filter out the sound of her own frantic pulse. A minute passed, then another, then a faint sharp crack from the ground floor, followed by the low, guttural groan of the heavy side door being forced open. They were inside. A cold wave of pure terror washed over her, so intense it made her feel nauseous. They were no longer waiting. The hunt had begun. She gently shook Leo awake, her hand over his mouth. "Shh," she whispered, her voice a choked, barely audible breath. "It's time to go. Be very, very quiet." The boy's eyes were wide with terror in the gloom, but he nodded, his small body trembling. Peeking through the crack in the floorboards again, she saw them, 2 large, hulking shapes, moving with a swift, brutal efficiency through the ground floor. Their powerful flashlights cut sharp, aggressive beams through the darkness, sweeping across the debris-strewn floor. They were dressed in dark work clothes, their faces obscured by shadows and pulled-down beanies. They weren't there to talk. They weren't there to negotiate. Their movements were predatory, purposeful. One of them carried a heavy canvas bag, the other a large, red canister. The sight of that canister sent a jolt of ice through Elena's veins. Gasoline, an accelerant. Terrible accidents can happen. Small fires. Finch's words echoed in her mind. A prophecy about to be fulfilled. They weren't just here to retrieve the box. They were here to erase everything, including them. They were here to finish the job their employer's father had started 50 years ago. Elena's mind was a maelstrom of panic. There was no way out. The main stairs were the only way down, and the men were directly below them. They were trapped, boxed in, a rat in a cage, waiting for the exterminators. She looked around the attic in desperation, her eyes searching for an escape route that didn't exist. The holes in the roof were 30 feet up. The windows were sheer drops onto broken asphalt. A sob of pure despair caught in her throat. She had failed. She had led her son into a death trap. She pulled him close, burying her face in his hair, a primal, protective gesture against the inevitable. She could hear the men beginning to ascend the metal stairs, their heavy boots clanging with a slow, deliberate, terrifying rhythm. Each step was a hammer blow, counting down the last seconds of their lives. It was over. All of it was for nothing. Suddenly, a piercing, electronic wail shattered the night. It was a car alarm, shrill and relentless, slicing through the silence. It came from outside, from across the street. Santiago, he had seen them. It was the signal. The two men on the stairs froze, their flashlights pointing wildly. A muffled curse came from one of them. The alarm was a deafening, beautiful shriek of chaos thrown into their cold, methodical plan. It was a distraction. It was a chance. A tiny, miraculous window of opportunity. The fire escape, Elena whispered, the words galvanizing her into action. She had seen it earlier, a rusted, skeletal metal ladder clinging to the back wall of the attic, leading down into a dark, debris-filled alley. It was a terrifying, uncertain path, but it was their only one. Grabbing the backpack in Leo's hand, she scrambled towards it, her heart pounding with a desperate, wild hope. The fire escape window was painted shut, sealed by decades of grime and neglect. Elena threw her shoulder against it, grunting with the effort. The old wood groaned but didn't budge. She could hear the men below, their initial confusion turning to angry shouts. They were coming. She didn't have time. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled desperation, she picked up a heavy piece of broken pipe from the floor and smashed it against the glass. The pane shattered with a loud, explosive crash, sending a cascade of glittering shards down into the alley below. The night air, cold and sharp, rushed in. "Don't look down," she told Leo, her voice tight. "Just hold on to me." She slung the heavy backpack over her shoulders, the ledgers digging into her spine, and pushed her son through the broken window first, out onto the small, rusted platform. The metal was slick with dampness and felt terrifyingly unstable under her feet. The fire escape was a skeleton of rusted iron, clinging precariously to the brick wall. It groaned and shuddered under their weight, the sound terrifyingly loud in the night. The alley below was a pit of blackness. Elena went first, moving backwards, her feet searching for each narrow, treacherous step, her hands gripping the icy, rough metal of the railing. "Your turn, Leo. One step at a time. I've got you," she said, her voice a strained imitation of calm. The boy was crying softly, his small body shaking, but he did as he was told, his small hands gripping the ladder. Below them, a light flickered in one of the lower windows, an orange, dancing light. Then she smelled it, carried on the wind, the sharp, acrid scent of gasoline, followed by the unmistakable smell of smoke. They had started the fire. The clock was ticking. The entire building was about to become their funeral pyre. Halfway down, a rusted bolt gave way. A section of the railing tore free with a screech of tortured metal, plunging into the darkness of the alley with a distant crash. Elena cried out, flattening herself against the ladder, her heart seizing in her chest. For a terrifying moment, she felt the entire structure sway, threatening to peel away from the wall and send them plummeting to the ground. She held her breath, listening to the groaning metal, praying. The ladder held. "Keep going," she screamed, her voice raw with terror. "Don't stop." They moved faster, their hands and feet clumsy with panic, the metal rungs slick and cold. The smoke was thicker now, a gray plume billowing from a window just below them, carrying with it the heat of the growing blaze. She could hear shouting from inside the mill, the angry, frustrated roars of the two thugs whose plan had gone so horribly wrong. Just as their feet touched the solid, debris-strewn ground of the alley, they heard another sound, cutting through the wail of the car alarm. It was a different kind of siren, a fire truck. Santiago hadn't just set off his alarm. He had called it in. The sound was the most beautiful music Elena had ever heard. It was the sound of witnesses, the sound of rescue. The thugs, small, accidental fire, was about to become a major incident, crawling with officials. They were no longer invisible. The game had changed. A new wave of adrenaline surged through her, this time not from fear, but from a fierce, triumphant hope. They had made it. They had the evidence, and they were out. The fire behind them was no longer just a threat. It was a beacon, illuminating the crime for the whole world to see. Elena grabbed Leo's hand and ran. They stumbled through the dark, narrow alley, their feet slipping on unseen refuse, their lungs burning from the cold air and the acrid smoke. The wail of the fire truck grew louder, closer, its flashing red and white lights beginning to strobe against the high brick walls of the surrounding buildings. They burst out of the alley and onto the street. Across from them, the small house stood, its porch light a welcoming, golden promise of safety. Mr. Santiago was standing there, a frail silhouette against the light, his hand still on the horn of his old car. His face was a mixture of terror and elation. He saw them and waved them frantically forward, a look of profound relief washing over his wrinkled features. They had done it. They had escaped the collapsing tomb, the evidence clutched tight in their hands. As they ran across the asphalt street towards the safety of Santiago's porch, Elena risked a final glance back at the Blackwood textile mill. Flames were now licking out of the shattered window of the fire escape, a hungry orange tongue tasting the night air. The smoke was a thick, black column, rising into the sky like a funeral pyre for all the mill's dark secrets. But the secrets were not in there anymore. They were in the backpack on her shoulders. They were safe. The fire wasn't an ending. It was a signal fire. It was a cleansing. She felt the diary pressed against her chest, a final testament that had survived the flames. They had escaped the inferno, and now they were about to start one of their own. As she collapsed onto the steps of Santiago's porch, pulling Leo into her arms, she knew the fight for survival was over. The fight for justice was about to begin. The sirens grew louder, a chorus of approaching justice that washed over the flashing red and white lights bathing Santiago's small living room. Elena sat on a worn floral sofa, the heavy backpack a sacred weight in her lap, her body still humming with the phantom vibrations of the fire escape. She clutched Leo, who was wrapped in a thick wool blanket, his eyes wide as he watched the chaos unfold outside. Across the room, Mr. Santiago stood transformed. The stooped, fearful man was gone, replaced by someone with a ramrod straight spine and a fire in his eyes that rivaled the one consuming the mill. He held an old rotary phone to his ear, his voice, for the first time, not a whisper of fear but a firm, clear command. "Sarah, it's Santiago," he said. "It's time. The Blackwood mill is burning, and I have the reason why." He was not calling the police. He was calling in an airstrike, and Elena knew, with a certainty that calmed her trembling hands, that she was holding the bomb. Santiago hung up the phone, the clatter of the receiver in its cradle sounding like a gavel. "Her name is Sarah Jenkins," he explained, his gaze meeting Elena's. "She's a journalist for the National Examiner, an old friend from the Union days. She doesn't bend, and she can't be bought." He looked towards the burning mill, his face illuminated by the hellish orange glow. The police in this city ate from Alistair Finch's hand for 20 years. His son's reach is just as long. Giving this to them would be like handing it back to Finch himself. He paused, the gravity of his next words filling the small room. The truth needs a bigger microphone. Sarah is that microphone. She's 2 hours away, but she's coming. The wait began. A new kind of agonizing suspense. They were safe from the fire and Finch's thugs, but now they were waiting for the world to answer their desperate call, hoping that the truth would be enough to protect them from the coming storm. True to his word, 2 hours later, a beat-up sedan pulled up behind the fire trucks. A woman emerged, plain-faced and weary, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. This was Sarah Jenkins. She moved with a brisk, no-nonsense energy, ignoring the police line and striding directly to Santiago's door. Inside, she wasted no time. She listened, her expression unreadable, as Elena, her voice cracking with exhaustion, recounted the entire nightmare, the eviction, the cold, the impossible breakfast, the secret room, and finally, Finch's chilling, veiled threats. Then, on the scarred surface of Santiago's small kitchen table, Elena laid out the evidence. The cracked leather of Robert Miller's diary and the thick, heavy ledgers with their columns of damning numbers. Under the single, dim light bulb, the 50-year-old secrets felt ancient, sacred, and incredibly dangerous. It was a king's ransom in truth. Sarah Jenkins picked up the diary with a reverence that surprised Elena. She turned the fragile pages, her sharp eyes scanning the frantic script. She cross-referenced a date with an entry in the ledger, her finger tracing a line to a payment made to the fire marshal. The mask of professional detachment on her face slowly crumbled, replaced by a look of stunned, horrified comprehension. "My God," she whispered, looking from the books to Santiago's haunted face, then to Elena's defiant one. "This is real, all of it." She pulled out her phone, her movements now sharp and urgent. She dialed a number, and when someone answered, her voice was low and commanding. "David, it's Sarah. Kill the front page for tomorrow. I don't care what it is. I have it, the ghost story of the Blackwood Mill. And it's not a story. It's a confession to a massacre, and I have the receipts." The burden was finally shifting. The next 24 hours were a whirlwind of controlled chaos. Sarah Jenkins, true to her word, did not go to the local police, shielding Elena and Santiago in a secure motel. She took the original diary and ledgers directly to the state attorney general's office in the capital. The AG, a formidable woman named Eleanor Vance, who had built a career on prosecuting the untouchable, saw the case for what it was, a legacy-defining battle against the kind of deep-rooted corruption she had sworn to destroy. The evidence was undeniable, the human story heart-wrenching. Within hours, a state-level task force was formed, operating in complete secrecy. The arson at the mill, which Finch had intended as a final, silent cleanup, had instead become the roaring fire alarm that awakened the state's most powerful investigators. Finch's carefully constructed world of influence began to crumble, silently and swiftly. The arrest was not a quiet affair. It was a spectacle of fallen power, broadcast live on the national news that Sarah's paper had broken. Arthur Finch, in the middle of a shareholder meeting in his gleaming skyscraper Minday, did not see it coming. State investigators, armed with a warrant from the AG herself, strode onto the 40th floor. The cameras captured his face as the handcuffs were snapped onto his wrists. The mask of calm, ruthless authority shattered, revealing a contorted visage of pure, sputtering rage and disbelief. Led past his stunned executives, the man who had moved through the world like a god, who had threatened Elena with the casual arrogance of a king, was reduced to a common criminal. The sight of him being forced into the back of an unmarked car was a vindication so powerful it made Elena weep, a cathartic release of the terror he had inflicted upon her. Justice, after 50 years, had finally come for the Finches. The story detonated across the country. It was more than a crime. It was a dark American fable. The Blackwood Massacre, they called it. The tale of a Gilded Age industrialist, a brave bookkeeper murdered for his conscience, a haunted security guard's 50-year vigil, and the homeless mother who, in searching for shelter, found the key to unlocking a city's darkest secret. The national attention was a cleansing fire. Descendants of the murdered Union men, families who had been told for decades that their loved ones died in a tragic accident, finally had the truth. The city, which had been built on Finch money and Finch influence, was forced into a painful reckoning with its own complicity. The name Finch, once a symbol of power and prestige, was now synonymous with murder and corruption. The ghosts of the mill were no longer whispering, they were screaming, and the entire nation was forced to listen. In the ensuing legal firestorm that dismantled the Finch empire, a victims' compensation fund was established by the state, seeded with millions seized from Finch's assets. As the key witness whose courage had brought the entire conspiracy to light, Elena was awarded a sum so large it seemed like a misprint on the official document. She sat in a lawyer's clean, quiet office as the number was explained to her. It wasn't just enough to be safe, it was enough to be free. For her whole life, the weight of generations of poverty, of scraping by, of the constant, gnawing fear of the next bill, lifted all at once. She didn't feel joy or excitement. She simply felt a profound, shuddering release. She lowered her head into her hands and sobbed, not for the horrors she had endured, but for the simple, staggering fact that for the first time in her life, she and her son would finally, truly, be okay. 6 months later, the sound that filled the house was not the drip of a leaky roof or the scuttling of rats, but the cheerful, rhythmic hum of a brand-new sewing machine. Sunlight streamed through a large, clean window, illuminating the dust-free air. The house was modest, but it was theirs, with a small yard where green grass grew. The smell was not the thick stench of mold and decay, but the warm, savory aroma of a chicken roasting in the oven for dinner. Elena sat at her kitchen table, not counting her last few dollars, but watching Leo as he eagerly showed her the A+ on his science test from his new school. He was healthy, happy, his face full, his eyes bright. The haunted, gaunt look was gone, replaced by the simple, untroubled joy of a child who feels safe. The deep, aching despair that had been Elena's constant companion was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady peace that felt more precious than any amount of money. Elena looked out the window at Leo, who was now in the backyard, laughing as he chased a soccer ball. The ghosts of the Blackwood Mill were finally silent, their story told, their justice served. She felt the warmth of the afternoon sun on her face, a simple, profound pleasure she had almost forgotten. Her life had not just been saved. It had been utterly reborn from the ashes of that terrible place, built on a foundation of courage she never knew she had. The story became a local legend, a reminder that some truths refuse to stay buried and that even the most desperate soul can spark a fire that illuminates the world. Every life holds a story of quiet courage waiting to be told. If tales of justice and overcoming the impossible, like Elena's, inspire you to believe in the power of truth, subscribe to our channel and join a community dedicated to sharing them.